some people are saying that the freedom should be for them, but not for others. Let us build that wall. I don't think that is what was intended when the founding fathers came to this nation. And though they displaced people who were here, I believe that they came seeking a freedom that should be available to all. So when we celebrate the 4th of July, we should not just eat, drink, and be merry, but we should think more about those who don't have the freedom that we proclaim.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, for July 4th, our guest is Dr. Cal Williams. Born and raised in Monroe, Louisiana, Cal participated in the civil rights movement of the early 60s through his affiliation with the Congress of Racial Equality. He moved to Anchorage in 1965, where he continued his activism, serving as the NAACP president from 1968 to 1970. He was a delegate to the Democratic National Convention in Denver in 2008 when Barack Obama was declared the Democratic candidate for president. He was awarded an honorary doctorate in humane letters from the University of Alaska Anchorage in 2022. That same year, he collaborated with UAA history professor Ian Hartman and David Reamer in the writing of Black Lives in Alaska, a history of African Americans in the far Northwest. Our guest wrote the foreword to that book. Dr. Cal Williams, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks indeed. I'm honored to be here.
Tell us about your childhood.
My childhood was blessed, fortunate, lucky, whatever you might want to call it. Though I lived in the segregated South, I and my family had much interaction with white people on different levels. I attended Little Flower Catholic School. It was a unique experience. The Franciscan nuns and priests had come into Louisiana and put a school which happened to be just across the street from my grandmother. My grandmother was an active Methodist, and even though she was deep into her faith, she had heard that the school was a good school and that they taught great morals and belief in Jesus, but they also had a tremendous academic program. My grandmother advocated for me to go across the street to that school. I was fortunate enough to have the resources because my father, in entering the military, had signed an allotment for me that monthly I would receive a stipend. My grandmother used that to put me into this school just across the street.
You were born in 1941?
1941, yes, in Monroe, Louisiana.
And your father went to World War II?
My father went off to war almost immediately because 7 days after my birth, Pearl Harbor was bombed, and most of the men, especially the colored men, as they were called at the time, were thrown into war in harm's way, and my father, along with most of his peers, disappeared. Therefore, it was my paternal grandmother and my mother who had most of the influence and participation in my upbringing. Mm-hmm. And I did have 12 years at Little Flower Academy.
It was an integrated school?
No, not in that sense. All of the students were Black, but all of the nuns and priests were white, German, Polish.
And so did they view running a school for Black kids as being like part of their church's mission?
Absolutely. These Franciscan nuns and priests had come in there because Bishop Desmond, upon his taking over the parish of Louisiana, quickly noted that there was no schools and facilities and church and large presence of Catholics in northern Louisiana. He proposed and was successful in getting the Franciscans to put a Catholic school there in Monroe.
What was your experience like just growing up in Monroe outside of school?
The cocoon, I say, in which I lived with these Franciscan nuns and priests being all white and insisting that when we spoke with them, we looked them in the eye. It was unspoken in the South that you always look down and never look a white person in the eye when addressing them, just by the way we articulated and communicated with white people made them know that, hey, you must go to Little Flower. You sound different. You're different. Then there was this war that began, as I said, 1941 through 1945. Colored men were coming back from war all shot up and legs and arms amputated. And again, the curse and blessing of segregation was that they decided they needed colored nurses to take care of colored men who were coming back in these messy situations. Rather than have white ladies do it, they decided to create the licensed practical colored nurses. And my grandmother learned of that and leaped into it and became a licensed practical colored nurse and eventually president of the licensed practical colored nurses of Louisiana. There again, she was active in the Methodist Church. She was in the medical field. She had a great interaction with doctors and patients who were white. And oftentimes there was this one family, the Bedoids, and Miss Geraldine Bedoid had 5 children, and my grandmother was called upon in the case of 3, the latter 3, to come and be in the home on a daily basis and watch out and monitor and take care of these kids and tell Mrs. Bedoid how to raise the children and keep them nutrited. So I would accompany her in going to these white homes and became friends and felt like I was a sibling of some sort with Nancy and Eugene and these kids, because my grandmother was giving orders and taking care of them and me at the same time. Again, though I was in the segregated South, I had this view that we were all the same until when I was 14 years of age, some 70 miles from me, another young man who was 14 years of age at the time was killed because they say he whistled at a white lady. His name was Emmett Till. He and I were 14 at the same time in 1955 when he was lynched. That changed my perspective on life, on who I was and who I was going to be. At the time that he was killed for supposedly whistling at a white lady, I, because of the movies that I had watched and seen that were always with white actors, I was madly in love with Marilyn Monroe and certain that she and I were going to be married. That murder of Emmett Till changed that view of the possibilities in life. I knew from that day on that there was a difference between me and white people, and that though I had been surrounded by loving white people, there was an ugly system in the land in which I lived.
Did you discuss Emmett Till with your family? Was it discussed at school? Do you remember how the community received that information, processed that information about what had happened to Emmett Till?
The vivid image I have is that there was this magazine called Jet Magazine, came out weekly. And my father was a subscriber to the magazine, and they didn't put the picture of that in my face, but I somehow found that magazine and looked in it and saw the grotesque look of this body in the casket in this magazine.
Because his mother had insisted on an open casket funeral.
Indeed. Mamie Till wisely and fortuitously, for history's sake, did allow the world to see that image, which motivated us to say, this is appalling and we're not going to take any more of this abuse. That gave me the seed to want to do something, though it was not organized and formulated until many years later when CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, came into Monroe, Louisiana, and oriented us and taught us the ways of protest.
Mm-hmm. So you knew when you were 14 that you felt motivated. You realized you were different. You realized what had happened was wrong. You wanted to be a part, but you didn't know how to do it at that time.
We somehow said, oh, that happened in Mississippi, and it would never happen here in Monroe, Louisiana.
But it was only 70 miles away.
Indeed. So we shielded ourselves from fear by saying that was that state. Mississippi is a terrible place. Mm-hmm. If you drive through there, keep your head low, etc. We've had all of these protective notions of saying that evil was not exactly where we are.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that was true?
No, because again, later when we started protesting in Monroe, Louisiana, we had pushback even from the mayor, who owned a restaurant and did not want us there. In fact, told us that. And when we protested, some of his workers walked off, threw their aprons down, and walked out not wanting to serve us. That was from the mayor. And in the medical treatment, everything was separate but not equal. Schools were totally not equal. Books would be used in the white schools, marked up, torn up, and then sent over to the black public school. Carroll High was a black public school. I, again, was going to Little Flower Academy. With that kind of separation of intelligence and awareness, etc., we were in position to be organized and unified, but separated, if you will, by those who had favor with the white man, such as Henry Carroll, who was the principal of the colored school. He didn't want his position shaken or to have the white power structure look at him as not being able to control those colored people. He was caught in a vice of privilege, yet imprisonment philosophically. Mm. He, in fact, said to us when we were doing the civil rights struggle that if we just be patient, segregation would work itself out in time. Some of his advice was good in a sense because we were young and radical and would have probably run off the cliff without some of the cautions that were given us. But we were also inspired by such people as Dr. Reddick, who was a dentist and would oftentimes give us the money that we would use to go to challenge these public accommodation places. We had money that he had given. If we were arrested, he would bail us out, etc. We had Dr. Pierce, who was a black pharmacist there in Monroe, Louisiana, and he was encouraging. Abraham Bowie, an insurance agent, black man. There were those who supported the movement, were independent enough economically to not fear reprisals, such as others who worked for wages or were under the economic empowerment or the economic restraint of a boss who could fire them for finding out that they had registered to vote. Dare you go down and register to vote? I heard that you were down there with those civil rights workers, etc. So there was great oppression and certainly fear. I give credit to a lady, we called her Mama LaPoo. This lady lived in an alley just behind the school that I attended, Little Flower, and she was brave enough to allow the civil rights workers, these white people and black people, to live in a cohabitational situation where she had rented rooms to the civil rights workers. She received threats constantly saying, yeah, you got those civil rights workers over there. You got those people living together and that we're going to burn your house down. But she stood fast, and she, like many women and men, fortunately gave us the courage to continue.
Did your family support you being involved in the civil rights movement?
There was mixed emotions in it. There was certainly fear of the danger, but I can remember my mother and the epiphany that she had when we, members of CORE, had gone in a caravan to New Orleans, where she was at the time, and we had picketed the federal building there because of laws that were unjust, in our opinion. CORE, we had organized, mobilized, coming down to New Orleans from various parts of Louisiana. And I went to my mother's house with 4 of the CORE workers that were working with me, 2 of them white ladies, 1 a white man, and 1 a black man. And we told her that next day we were going to have a big rally at this church in town. And she was giving food to these visitors, my friends and stuff, and listening to them. And she attended the rally the next day and got caught up in the spirit of that. She was a gospel singer. She loved music. So she was singing and jumping and clapping her hands and carrying on. And the next thing I knew, there she was on the telephone telling some of her friends, yeah, my son and I, we in the civil rights movement. So that was a great day for me in that regard, that my mother overcame her concern and fear for me. My grandmother had by then passed away, but I'm pretty sure she would have been supportive. My grandfather, paternal grandfather, taught me how to drive a stick shift car, how to plant in the garden, how to raise chickens and care for my rabbits, etc. So I love him for that. And he also told me how to travel, how to prepare yourself to be safe traveling in a segregated world, how to carry your food and stuff to make sure that it lasted from Monroe all the way down to New Orleans, and where to get on or off the bus and what to look for. He could not read, but he would say, look for that red building with the flag up on top of it, and it's got a lion on the steps. So that's the way he would travel.
Did you have a relationship with your father?
Yes, after he came back from war, I was 4 years old. So I had this relationship with this man up on the wall in the picture with the uniform on, and that was my father. Until this guy came home looking different from that picture up on the wall, and I had to adjust that, oh, this guy is my father. And my father came back from the war with what's now called PTSD, what was back then called shell shock. So occasionally he would be triggered by something. The flickering kerosene lamps would look like war when he'd wake up at 1 o'clock in the morning and this lamp is flickering. That would send him back into combat mode, and he would start cursing and yelling and oftentimes attacking my mother because she was light-skinned in hue, and in that flickering lamp, he saw her as a Japanese person and would start attacking and stuff. But
he'd been in the Pacific.
yes. But then when he was not having these spells or fits as they would call, were infrequent, he was a wonderful guy. He could fix, I thought, anything from broken radios to carpentry type work to mechanical work on cars. His work in the military was in transportation, handling big trucks and stuff. So he came back with those skills, mechanical skills, but he never really put them to practice.
So you joined the military.
Yes, I went into the Air Force, and that was because Vietnam was on.
Was that when you were 18?
1963. I was
22.
Yes, 22 years of age. And Vietnam was heating up, and they were going and getting black kids, again, almost like they were doing when my father was there, in spite of the fact that if you were in college, this draft didn't come and get you because you were in college. It was working well for white students, but they were drafting black students. And a colleague of mine at Grambling University, or Grambling College, it was called at the time, said, "Hey, man, we're going to get drafted in the Army. I think we better go and try to get into the Air Force. That's a better branch, and you don't get shot at, and you can fly an airplane." And so I went down with him just to give him moral support, but it ended up with the recruiter calling me in the middle of the night, say, "The guys feel like you're a leader, and if you go in the military, they'll go." My ego set in. I'll go. When we got to training, I found out that the recruiter had told all four of us the same thing, that we were the leader, and if you go,
everyone will go. That's funny.
There I was in the Air Force, and fortunately, because of test scores, etc., I was selected to be in the Titan II missile program. That would shield me from actually going abroad or into the jungles of the war. We were at Vandenberg Air Force Base monitoring and maintaining Titan II missile systems. Fortunately, we were not called upon to engage in that war. My grandmother died, and she was taking care of my father off and on because, as I said earlier, he would often have episodes that required treatment, and she was caring for him. When she died in January of 1964, I asked for a transfer to the Air Force Base near Monroe, Louisiana, Barksdale at Shreveport, Louisiana, and was told that that's not a place that they have missiles, so we're going to offer you a hardship discharge. I said, "No, I want an honorable discharge." They said, "That is an honorable discharge." I said, "Oh, where do I sign?" My career in the Air Force was cut short. I got out April of 8th, 1964, came home to Monroe, Louisiana, and there found these CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, young people running around in my hometown, organizing, mobilizing, teaching voter registration, and challenging the system. And I wanted some of that action. But then I had to be oriented to not think of physical attacks when called nigger, when pushed and slapped and spit upon. They were teaching the principles of Mahatma Gandhi, which was nonviolence, to diffuse the strength out of words such as I said, nigger. It's more offensive to me for people to say, oh, he said the N-word. They didn't say N-word. They said nigger. And if we give that word a negative power that it doesn't have, then we are allowing ourselves to be victimized by that word, which is a word of history. And I don't want any word, deed, or action of history to be buried.
How'd you get to Alaska?
Right after all of this action of 1964, Freedom Summer, marching and demonstrating and protesting there in Louisiana, friends of mine, the LeViege family, Charles LeViege and John LeViege, who had attended school with me, they had come to Alaska almost immediately after graduating from high school because their father, Samuel LeViege, had been in Alaska since we were in grade school. And he would come home for Christmas and show off nugget watches and rings. He would order a Cadillac in Detroit, fly to Detroit, pick up the Cadillac, and drive it down to Louisiana, Monroe, and impress everybody as he drove past. Did you see that car? Oh, yeah, I saw it yesterday. Man, that's Sam LeViege. He's up in Alaska. Oh, yeah, they got money up there. They got gold on the street. You can just be walking by and find some gold. That's what he said. I saw his watch. Sam LeViege doing that at Christmas and oftentimes loading that car up with 2 or 3 guys that he had convinced to migrate to Alaska because of the great opportunity. That pipeline extended to me. His son, who had come to Alaska, had come home for Christmas vacation of 1964, and we ran around to the old places that we had run to as kids, and they convinced me to come to Alaska to see if I would like it. We arrived back here January the 5th, 1965, and I am still here trying to see if I like it.
So did you like it right away?
I did, though it great contrast. We left Louisiana. It was 75, 80 degrees. We arrived in Anchorage at the airport where you have to get off the plane and go down a ramp and run to the building. It was 5 below the day we arrived, January the 5th, 1965. And I was not dressed for the occasion.
What'd you do when you got here?
The first day I arrived, I met a guy named Neil Kerniger, who was a friend of the LeViege family. He was the son of a doctor, Dr. Kerniger. He had German ancestry. He had a little Volkswagen car. And he picked us up, and he was a friend of the LeViges because they all attended Alaska Methodist University, which is now called Alaska Pacific University. I met Neil on the very first day that I arrived, and we are still friends to this very day. John was working at Providence Hospital in the kitchen, and he was a student at Alaska Methodist University. He and his brother were star basketball players for AMU. And John told Mrs. Johnson, who was the dietitian in the kitchen there at Providence Hospital, that he had a friend who was a Catholic, had just arrived in town, and was looking for work. Mrs. Johnson said, yes, bring him tomorrow. Second day in town, I went to work at Providence Hospital in the kitchen, where I was the director of pots and pans. And I did those pots and pans in such a fashion that nobody caught COVID.
I bet. It seems like you landed here and things fell into place right away. You had a purpose, you had a job. You didn't stay in Alaska forever because you did go to Hollywood for a short time. Tell us about those first few years and why you went to Hollywood.
As I said, I started working at Providence Hospital. Shortly after that, I went to work at Alaska Psychiatric Institute as a nursing aide. We would engage with the patients, play checkers, make sure they took their medications, run down Lake Otis Parkway to catch them when they tried to run away. And I worked for the municipality. Then along came my term as president of the NAACP. In 1968, young people in the Fairview area and Willard Bowman, who later became a state representative and the director of what he created with Governor Egan, the Alaska State Human Rights Commission. Willard came to me and suggested that I run for president of the NAACP against a good friend of his, Blanche McSmith, who had been the president of the NAACP for years. Willard thought that his friend, who had this master's degree, who had adopted a native child, Kimberly, who was married to a white man, Bill McSmith, who owned an appliance shop, selling appliances and repairing them. They were very successful in moving the NAACP to engage with the military commanders about the unequal opportunity out on base, disparate treatment, even in the barbershops and salons. But the NAACP, in Willard's opinion, was too heavily engaged in activities that the poor people couldn't afford to be involved with. They were having banquets in hotels and wearing furs and giving out plaques and awards. Willard thought the fight was in the street, and he was convinced that me, with this civil rights background, was the perfect person to bring it to the people. So I ran. Mrs. McSmith put out the rumor that a Black Panther was running to become the president of the NAACP. This put fear into the hearts of the Black and white community, and the membership swelled, and in 1968, 3,000 people voted. I won by 130 some votes and became the president of the NAACP. That went for 2 years, 68 to 70.
When you were president of the NAACP, how were Black people treated in general in Anchorage? Did you feel integrated? Was it different than Louisiana?
Okay. Anchorage, Alaska, I found to be a place that was totally different from Monroe, Louisiana, whereas we had just been fighting to integrate places. I found numerous places in Anchorage where Blacks and whites were already eating and dining together. There were Black people walking around with quite a bit of money because they were working in construction. At the same time, they were living separately, segregated. There's a place called the Eastchester area, and it's down near where Shiloh Church is, Chester Creek. That was the low land in topography. It would be muddy and swampy, and when breakup come, that's when snow melts, etc., people were walking into mud over their ankles down in there. Cars had mud halfway up the wheels, but all of that land was owned by black people because black people were not allowed to buy land anywhere else other than down in the flats. In the flats, they had 5 or 6 nightclubs and bars. And these bars and nightclubs would be filled at night with clientele, both black and white. So there was nighttime integration in the flats, in the clubs. And the bars closed at 5 a.m. All of the white people would come up out of there and disappear. And it was all black again. Until urban renewal. Urban renewal came along. Mayor George Sullivan got with HUD, Housing and Urban Development. HUD had promised, if you can find a blighted area, we will give you money to go in, purchase the land, improve the land, put in sewers, running water, paved streets, and repatriate that land with some of the original homeowners. It was such a long time between acquisition of the land and the land being ready for reoccupation that the original landowners, a number of them, had died or lost the money that they had been given or left the state or just lost interest in living in that area. Rather than having it replaced with home ownership, everybody owning their land, a plan came that a company called Johnson out of Irvine, California, came in with a grandiose idea of putting in low-cost rental, and that is what is there now, a great deal of rental houses as opposed to the dream of home ownership. But up the hill in an area called Fairview, black people had been living. Sam LeViege, who I told you about, built a home on 14th Avenue there. Lovely home, big home for its time. John Parks, a carpenter, built a home with all kinds of fancy carpentry in that Fairview area. The Fairview area a lot of it was owned by a guy named Bevers, Tom Bevers, or Tom Beavers, as some called him. He was the first fire chief in the city of Anchorage. He owned his homeland near 10th and M Street. There he had a mink farm and a fox farm. He came up with the idea for Fur Rendezvous, and they were having auctions of fur, etc. He, as I said, was the first fireman. And buying this land over in Fairview, he started selling parcels of land to black people, and black people were buying and developing in the Fairview area. Tom Bevers died, and his sister came to claim the body. And then it was learned that he was a black man because she was very dark in hue, whereas Tom Bevers looked like a white man.
So he passed as white.
And he passed as white. He was our first fire chief. He owned all of that land over in Fairview, and he is the creator of that area.
Was it a scandal when his sister came to claim the body?
Not really. There was surprise, and of course, yes, some people were, oh my God, scandalized. But more, she came to claim the body and take it back with her. But the townspeople wanted the body, and he is buried in the Anchorage Memorial Cemetery here. Tom Bevers, our first fire chief, they convinced her, no, leave him here, and he is honored.
Was she surprised that he had passed as white, or do you know about that?
I don't know. I don't even know her name. I'm fairly certain she's passed on now, but that would be a great take to find out what she thought about it, the whole situation. For 2 years, 68 to 70, president of the NAACP. At the end of that term, I decided if I'm ever going to go to Hollywood and be like Sidney Poitier, who I had admired from childhood, I had been on stage since Sister Consuela threw me on stage in the 10th grade to do plays. and acting with a major in speech and theater and radio production at Grambling. That was my dream, to go to Hollywood. And I felt once I arrived at the airport, everybody was going to say, "He's here now, roll the film." But it was a crazy place. A lot of, quote, producers were people who hadn't done any work in years, but they were still boasting and going to do something next week. So you'd get distracted and drawn off into areas and places trying to make it. Oh, if you shave your beard. Oh, if you grow a beard. I just shaved it because this guy told me to do it. Do you have photographs? No, I don't have. Go to my brother and he will take the photographs for you. Do you have an agent? No, I don't have an agent. Well, go get an agent. And you go to get an agent. The agent says, "What work have you done?" You say, "I haven't done any work." They won't hire me until I get an agent. "Oh, get some work and come back, and then I will hire you as an agent." How does this work? I don't know. There was all of that confusion. And I was running up against situations where they were hiring Jim Brown, O.J. Simpson, Fred Hampton, Rosie Greer, football players who had name recognition because that name would draw ticket buyers. And we don't know who this thespian is who can articulate and play Shakespearean parts. We're not looking for that. It was a period of Black exploitation. The movies that they were making, Superfly and Shaft, were movies of revenge and or one-uppance or getting our share of the pie by hook or crook or drug dealing or force of gun, etc. And we, true actors, were being overlooked. Even for a part in Sounder, I went up for the part. Sounder was about sharecroppers in Louisiana. And you need to use dialect and all that, which I certainly can do, having grown up there. But I walked into the office and said, "I'm Cal Williams. I'm here from the McClendon agency, and I'm here to audition for this part." I found out later that walking in, I had lost the role because they said I was too articulate.
Wow.
I stayed there, and I did do 2 movies, one called A-Bar, where I was a member of a motorcycle gang, and another, My Own Peacemaker, where I was indeed the star as a gunslinger in this movie about people running me off my land. I had retired from gunslinging, but they made me put them on and go into town and shoot up the place. And that was the happy ending. So I did a small part with Angie Dickinson in Police Story. The part was we blacks, 4 of us walking down the sidewalk, was walking in her direction. She was in our part of town. It looked like it was going to be a menacing, terrible situation. But then we opened up and allowed her to walk through. Oh, what a part.
So at a certain point, you decided that you were going back to Alaska?
I did. I decided that there was hypocrisy in Hollywood and there was realism in Alaska, that there were guys in Alaska walking around with raggedy blue jeans on and big wads of money in their pocket. There were people in Alaska who said they were going to do something and that were able to follow through. The realism and the true human interaction of Alaska was drawing me and home to me.
So what did you do when you got back?
I went to work for the municipality, the Anchorage Equal Rights Commission. I worked for the municipality in another capacity as an environmental health inspector. I was still active in rebel rousing, if you will, a member of the NAACP. In the church, the involvement back here in Alaska was great. this friend of mine, Charles LeViege, had gotten together with a group. Charles was one of the first African Americans to work in the banking system, the National Bank of Alaska. He learned to package loans and fill out applications. He organized a syndicate, if you will, of African Americans under an umbrella called Univentures. And they erected a building at the corner of 13th and Gamble on the northeast corner there. And that building at the time was worth $2.5 million. It was featured in Jet magazine. Again, Charles didn't even show up for the photograph, but the rest of the family and I was in this photograph of a groundbreaking at that building, which happened to be across the street from the Cars Quality Center at 13th and Gamble. That Cars Quality Center is where the NAACP in August of 1962 marched and picketed for a couple of months and was successful in getting the first African American to work as a box boy, a checker, a manager, later a vice president, and his name was Richard Watts. His father, Richard Watts Sr., had marched and picketed to get a black hired in there, and it turned out that his son was the black that they hired, and he worked there for 53 years. So
Wow.
history was made twice on that very corner.
Wow. You hosted a talk show, didn't you?
I did a talk show, and also it was a television show.
Oh, television show.
Slipping into Darkness, we did at Channel 2 television, and we did one called Cross Culture at KAKM public broadcast. The Cross Culture one, we interviewed such people as Dick Gregory.
I want to know about that. What was it like? Would he come into the studio? Was he here?
Yes.
Dick Gregory was in Alaska.
He was here as keynote speaker for the NAACP, and they allowed for him to do an interview at KAKM. I was the host and got to interview him. A comedian group, Willie Tyler and Lester. I interviewed Tony Brown from the Tony Brown Journal when he came as a guest of the Alaska Black Caucus. O.C. Smith, a recording artist. Julian Bond, when he came as a guest of the NAACP. These were interviews done at KAKM through Cross Culture. The show that I did at KTUU, Channel 2, were a variety entertainment type shows similar to the night show format, where we'd come on and give news accounts of what was happening in the Black community, and we'd have some musical guests, and we'd conclude with some sort of comedy routine. Those were great days of engagement with the media.
I didn't know that part of your history. So get us from there to today.
From coming here, all those many years, I've been enticed first off by my mother. Boy, when you coming home? Now by my daughter. Daddy, when you coming out to Alaska and coming home?
Is your daughter in Louisiana?
She lives in Hope, Arkansas.
Hope, Arkansas.
And I had to tell them that this is home and probably where I will be buried. Here, many blessings have come, much opportunity. I've had jobs, including the one from which I retired at Alaska Housing Finance Corporation, where I was called and told about the job. There have been jobs that I've been on where I had worked a couple of weeks before somebody walked up and said, hey, you got to fill out an application. That certainly is the unusual, but that has been the blessings that I have had. I have received awards and accolades, including the Franciscan Award, which is one of the awards that I am most proud of because it came from the Archdiocese of Anchorage. It is named after St. Francis, who was the patron saint of Little Flower Academy. And by having been awarded that, I feel I came full circle with what the Franciscans had intended when they opened that school in a little segregated town of Monroe, Louisiana, with a challenge to prove to Hitler that colored children could learn with the same capacity as members of the Aryan race that he was creating. And then just yesterday, I received acknowledgement as one of the 400 history keepers from the 400-year African American History Commission. This is a quasi-federal commission that is going across the nation collecting African American history. I am honored to be walking in the footsteps of George Harper, who I give credit for being the father of African American history. George came into this town in 1991, and he was the first person that I know that had a genuine interest in collecting and preserving African American history. He dug up old photographs of African Americans here in the 1800s, whalers who came into this nation. And it is because of his work that the 400-year African American Commission came here. All of these things are connected because of George bringing interest and value to Alaskan African American history. And that is my pledge to, as long as I am alive, continue his work.
Since it is July 4th, do you have any perspective or insight into the state of our country today? Where you think we're headed?
I fear that we are being tested for what we say we believe, that we are one nation under God, indivisible, with
liberty
and justice for all. I feel that is being threatened, that some people are saying that the freedom should be for them, but not for others. Let us build that wall. I don't think that is what was intended when the founding fathers came to this nation. And though they displaced people who were here, I believe that they came seeking a freedom that should be available to all. So when we celebrate the 4th of July, we should not just eat, drink, and be merry, but we should think more about those who don't have the freedom that we proclaim.
Dr. Cal Williams, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you indeed. It is my great honor and pleasure. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you. Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call 907-269-0123.